Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we retell the old Scottish folk tales and fairy stories so that they will never be forgotten. Before I start, I know it's been a few weeks since our last story, and I'm sorry, I have been incredibly busy with visiting children and grandchildren and all of the chaos that comes with that. Anyway, this week, I thought I'd get back into the groove, so to speak, with a classic Scottish adventure story that was told to me many, many years ago, and which coincidentally appears in a book of Scots folk tales which a friend of mine recently sent me. So, I'd like to say a big thank you and a huge shout out to Jamie Blanche for reminding me about this week's tale. And then, without further ado, let's sit back and begin the story of the Sea Maiden. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, there was a young fisherman in Ayrshire, who we will name Malcolm the Injudicious. Malcolm was a poor fisherman. Not to say that he was bad at his chosen profession, but he could only afford a small rowing boat, and his nets were tattered, and he could never afford to repair them with the poor catches that he pulled in from the sea. After months of catching very little, Malcolm the Injudicious was fishing late into the evening one night, when suddenly, as the moon's white light sparkled on the waves, a sea maiden rose from the waters and pulled herself up to rest her arms and head on the side of his small boat. Sea maidens, or Maitún na Tunye in Gaelic, which means maids of the waves, are Scottish mermaids in the classic sense, in that they appear as beautiful young women, but with tails like that of a salmon. Sea maidens can be found in the seas and freshwater bodies of the Borders and Midlands of Scotland. Like most of Scotland's magical creatures, they seem more often to be malevolent than kind. However, there are stories of sea maidens who fell in love with sailors, and the sons of these unlikely unions are said to grow up to be exceptional sailors and pilots of ships. Sea maidens are also known in some coastal towns as mere witches, or Cailleach na Tunye. They can bless or curse people, and are said to be able to control the currents of the waters and command the creatures of the seas and lochs. If one can be caught, then in exchange for its freedom, it may grant a wish or give a person its protection. The sea maiden clutching the side of Malcolm's boat had long, golden hair and dark green eyes like the depths of the ocean. She looked at Malcolm with her large eyes and asked, "Fisherman, fisherman, here on the waves, how many fish dost thou catch these days?" Malcolm answered the beautiful sea maiden, "Not nearly enough, if truth be told. I confess I can barely feed mysel' on what I bring in." The sea maiden looked thoughtful for a few moments, and then said, "If I sent fish into your net, in return what might I get? For all the fish in all the sea, what might a poor fisherman give to me?" "Ach," replied Malcolm, "as I said, good lady, I hae little to spare, and reckon nothing to repay such a debt." The sea maiden smiled, or at least the corners of her mouth turned up. "For herring by the hundred and trout by the ton, wouldst thou give me your full-grown first-born son?" Malcolm the Injudicious gave this some thought. Although probably not nearly as much thought as he should have, he reasoned that he was a young man, and he had not yet found a girl he liked, let alone thought of marriage or children. He might never have a son. "Full-grown, ye say," he said, "and I'd hae good catches every day." The sea maiden said nothing, but the corner of her mouth turned up again, and she nodded to Malcolm. "I reckon that's a deal I'd be a fool to refuse," said Malcolm, and he spat on his hand. and offered it to the Sea Maiden to shake. She reluctantly shook it and said, "The deal is struck. You shall have fish aplenty, and your son shall be mine when he reaches 20. With that, the Sea Maiden let go of the side of Malcolm's boat and disappeared into the murky depths of the ocean. After that day, the fortunes of Malcolm the Injudicious changed, just as the Sea Maiden had said they would. Every time he cast his nets into the ocean, they came in full of the finest fish that Malcolm had ever seen. In a short time, he went from poverty to prosperity. He bought new nets and then a bigger boat and became known as the most successful fisherman in the land. Malcolm eventually fell in love and married, and his firstborn child was a strong, healthy son. He named his son Rafferty, which is a word derived from Irish Gaelic, which means flood tide and is associated with abundance and plenty. Rafferty was his mother and father's pride and joy. He grew into a handsome and strong young man, honest and kind. However, the years passed faster than Malcolm thought possible, and soon the time was approaching for Rafferty's 19th birthday. His father, Malcolm, remembered well the agreement that he had made with the Sea Maiden all those years ago, and he was greatly afeared that next year she would come and take what he had promised the Mere Witch, his firstborn son, Rafferty. Malcolm worried as the days passed, and as the time drew nearer, he became more and more sorrowful and heavy-hearted. Rafferty noticed his father's dejected mood and pestered him constantly, until finally he revealed the reason and told his son about the bargain that he had made with the Sea Maiden when he was himself but a young and foolish man. Rafferty pondered the problem far more logically than his father Malcolm. Malcolm suggested fighting the Mere Witch, but Rafferty pointed out that Sea Maidens were powerful creatures who could shapeshift at will. Even finding the Sea Maiden in order to fight her seemed an impossible task, when she could be any fish in the sea or any bird in the sky. Next, Malcolm considered sending Rafferty into hiding, but his son pointed out that Sea Maidens could go wherever there was water, which in Scotland was absolutely everywhere. Unless he fled to some distant desert, then the Mere Witch would surely find him. Finally, Rafferty himself decided that the day after his 19th birthday, he would go out into the world and seek a means to defeat the Sea Maiden before she came for him on his 20th birthday. He asked his father Malcolm to go to the local blacksmith and have a great and strong sword made for him to protect himself on his journey. Malcolm went at once, and the blacksmith made a long and mighty-looking sword, which Malcolm gave to his son. However, when Rafferty swung the sword about his head, strong though the steel was, the sword bent with the force of the swing. So, Malcolm went again and told the blacksmith to make an even stronger sword. This time, the sword withstood Rafferty's mighty swing, but it broke in two when he struck a rock with the blade. So this time, Rafferty went with his father, and he worked the bellows of the furnace for the blacksmith for 3 days without rest, while the smith made a sword stronger and mightier than he had ever made before. Rafferty swung the sword about his head, and then with one sweep, sliced a boulder clean in two. "Very good," said Rafferty. "This blade should serve me well enough on my travels. Now, father, 'tis high time I was on my way." The next day, Rafferty saddled his father's black horse and set off to seek his fortune and his salvation in the lands of Scotland. For weeks, as he travelled, Rafferty took the world for his pillow, which meant he slept under the stars at night, with only his plaid for a blanket. He foraged for berries and nuts on the hills and hunted when he could in the forests. One day, Rafferty managed to bring down a deer in a forest, and that evening he was roasting it over his fire when he heard a great commotion from where he had butchered the animal not far away. When he went to investigate, he found a wild dog, a great hawk, and a sleek otter fighting over the scraps and bones. Rafferty spoke to the quarrelling creatures. "Friends, cease this useless fighting. Ye bicker over these scraps and bones, when I am more than happy to share the full bounty o' my hunt fairly with ye. Come, rest by my fire and be fed and at peace." The dog, the hawk, and the otter stopped fighting and cautiously approached the fire, settling themselves a short distance away. Rafferty took the deer off the fire and divided it into 10 portions. He gave 1 portion to the otter, because it was the smallest and required the least amount of food. Then he gave 2 portions to the hawk and 3 portions to the dog. For himself, he kept 4 portions. When they had all finished eating, and they were full and happy, to Rafferty's surprise, the animals spoke to him. The great black wild dog looked up at him and said, "Grow, for this kindness, if ever swiftness of foot or sharpness of tooth will give thee aid, then mind me. Speak my name, and I shall be at thy side." Then the hawk added, "Aye! Or if hardship comes upon thee, where swiftness of wing or crook of claw will help thee, then speak my name, and I shall come." Finally, the otter said, "Or if speed when swimming, or the grip of small claws and teeth will aid thee, then mind me. Speak my name, and I will be there." Rafferty gave the 3 creatures his thanks for their offer of service before they turned and left him. Then he went to sleep, and the next day went on his way again. Rafferty travelled on until he reached the castle of a great king. Here he managed to get work as a cattle herder for the king's cows. Each day, Rafferty would take the herd out to graze and keep watch over them. When he brought the herd back, they were milked, and he was paid by the amount of milk they gave, which was dependent on the quality of grazing which he was able to find. This was fine and fair, but as time went on, the grazing near the castle became more sparse as the cows ate up all of the fine green new grass. Rafferty began leading the herd farther and farther away from the castle in search of good grazing. One day, he led the herd farther than he ever had before and found a great green glen full of rich, healthy new grass. The cows grazed well that day. However, when Rafferty was getting the herd ready to drive them back to the castle, he heard a loud bellowing from the top of the glen. "Ha! I smell cows and I smell men. Who bringeth cattle to my glen?" And down the slope of the glen came stomping a great giant with a huge sword clutched in his hand. He came up to Rafferty and roared with laughter. "Flee, little man, or I shall kill thee. All of thy cows now belongeth to me." The giant, who was twice the size of Rafferty, was dressed in torn pieces of plaid sewn together. His sword was notched and dull, but was also longer than Rafferty was tall, and looked heavy enough to smash boulders when swung by the huge, strong giant towering over Rafferty. Despite the giant's terrifying appearance, Rafferty was unafraid. He looked up at the giant and slowly drew his own sword, then said, "I say not that, giant. There is no knowing, but killing me, I think, may be easier to say than do. These cattle belong to the king, and so shall they remain." The giant laughed again. Come then, tiny little man, and I shall slay thee where thee stand. Rafferty stepped forward, and he swung his blade in the blink of an eye. The sword moved through the air with the sound of tearing silk. The giant moved to block the strike, but Rafferty's blade cut clean through the giant's sword and then clean through his neck, slicing his head from his body. Leaving the body of the giant lying where it had fallen, Rafferty went up the glen in search of his home. He found the giant's house hidden in a corrie on the side of the mountain. In Scotland, a corrie is a large bowl-shaped hollow on the side of a mountain. Rafferty went into the giant's house, and inside there was silver and jewels, but he was careful to take nothing from the house when he left. Rafferty kenned well that such creatures as the giant often had brothers or kin, and he had no wish to bring another giant's vengeance down upon the good people of the castle, just for his greed. So he left everything as it was, and returned with the cattle to the king's castle. That evening, the cows gave more and finer milk than they ever had before, and Rafferty was well paid. For a few weeks after this, Rafferty brought the cows to graze in the glen each day, and the milk they gave was good. However, as time passed, the glen grew bare, and the grazing became not so good, and the cows gave less and less milk. Eventually, Rafferty decided to venture beyond the glen and past the home of the giant. Over the ridge of the mountain, he found another great glen of fresh green glass winding down the far side of the hill. He loosed the cows to graze and settled down to watch, as the herd did what cows do best, which is eat copious amounts of grass and produce huge amounts of cow poop. After a while, from the far end of the glen came a bellowing roar. Ha! I smell cows and I smell men. Who bringeth cattle to my glen? Stomping through the glen came a giant even bigger than the one that Rafferty had slain before. This giant carried a great axe in one hand and an iron shield slung on the other. Rafferty got up, and he walked to the centre of the glen between the approaching giant and the grazing herd of cows behind. The giant halted before the little herdsman and peered down at him before laughing. Flee now, tiny little man, or I shall slay thee where thee stand. All these cows that I can see henceforth now belong to me. Rafferty drew his sword and calmly said to the huge giant, I say not that, giant. There is no knowing, but killing me, I think, may be easier to say than do. These cattle belong to the king, and so shall they remain. The giant laughed again. No man has yet withstood my might. It is thy blood that I shall drink tonight. The giant lunged forward and brought his great axe down in a chopping strike. Rafferty jumped back, and the axe hit the ground an inch in front of him. He swung his sword to slice the haft of the axe, and it made a noise like tearing silk as it moved through the air. But although Rafferty had swung with all his strength, his blade rebounded from the axe handle with a metallic clang. The giant laughed again and raised his axe and shield, saying, Thunder iron my mither gave me. Nae mortal weapon now can save thee. Rafferty swung again, but this time the giant deflected the strike with his shield and almost caught Rafferty with a counter blow from the axe. Then there was a lengthy exchange of strikes and blocks, which saw Rafferty and the giant equal in skill and speed. But the giant's superior strength drove Rafferty back with a flurry of blows and chops from his axe. when Rafferty could retreat no farther, and it seemed as though the giant would kill him with the next swing of his great axe, the young herdsman called on the black wild dog which he had helped all those months ago. In a moment, the dog appeared at his side and leapt at the giant's throat. The giant put up his shield, blocking the dog, but the hound leapt again and again at the huge giant, which turned to face this new foe. As soon as the giant's back was exposed, Rafferty jumped into the air and swung his sword in a sweeping strike, which sliced clean through the giant's neck and cut its head from its body. Rafferty was exhausted from the fight with the giant, and he decided to take the cattle home early that day. He thanked the black wild dog for coming to his aid, and the dog told him, "Rawr, my debt is not yet paid at all, still will I come whene'er thee call." And with that the dog vanished. Then Rafferty went back to the king's castle, where the cattle gave good milk that evening. The next day, Rafferty went again to the second glen and put the cows out to graze. While the herd milled about the glen, he went to the far end to see if, like before, there was a house with treasure. Sure enough, at the far end, and hidden in the lee of a corrie, stood an old, tumble-down-looking bothy. When Rafferty approached the door, he was met by a little old woman with wispy white hair. Her face was wrinkled, and she was dressed in tattered rags. The old woman waved to Rafferty as he got closer, and she called to him, "Hail and good luck to thee, fisherman's son, who has fought two great giants and somehow has won. Come, brave herdsman, and enter my hame. Come share a wee dram and tell me your name. Thy mighty deeds are known to me, so come and let me honour thee." The old woman gestured with her free hand for Rafferty to cross the doorway into the bothy. Rafferty looked the ancient woman up and down. She was hunched over, and one of her arms was coiled around a gnarled walking stick as tall as she was. The word which sprung immediately to his mind was Cailleach, and he greatly mistrusted her words of welcome. "In before me, thou crone," he said, "for I like not flattery out of doors. Go in and let's hear thy speech." The old woman made to go into the bothy, but as soon as her back was turned, Rafferty drew his sword and in one swift swing cut the woman's head from her body. But when he did, some force tore the blade from his grip and it flew from his hands. The old woman's head fell to the ground, but her body remained standing, and the head laughed up from the floor. The witch reached down with both her hands and picked up her head, still cackling, and placed it back on her shoulders. Suddenly, she was not as she had been a moment before. Her stoop was gone, and she stood up straight and seemed taller than Rafferty was. Her tattered robes fluttered in mystic wind as she threw out her hands and began chanting in a language that Rafferty had never heard. Then a club made of what looked like lightning appeared in her hands, and she swung at Rafferty. He jumped back as the club passed in front of his face with a noise like the clap of thunder. Again and again the witch swung the club, and Rafferty could do naught but dodge and dive the wild swings. As the witch came forward, swinging, she cried, "You slew both of my giant sons, my mighty muckle precious ones. Foolish little mortal man, now die by the lesser Cailleach's hand." But as soon as she came out from beneath the shelter of the bothy, Rafferty called on the great hawk, and a moment later it plunged from the sky and clawed at the witch's hair and beat its wings about her head. The witch threw her lightning club down and raised her hands to fend off the furious bird. Green fire sprang from her fingers, but the hawk was swift and dodged the fire with ease. Rafferty picked up the magic club and brought it down on the witch's head in a mighty blow, and with a clap of thunder, the witch fell to the ground, dead. Rafferty thanked the hawk for helping him, and the hawk told him that if he ever needed it again, all he had to do was call its name and it would be there. Rafferty went into the bothy of the Lesser Cailleach, and he found stacks of jewels and silks. He felt safe now, knowing that both the giants and their terrible mother were gone, so he piled the riches onto the backs of the cows, and as he went back to the king's castle, he also took the treasures from the first giant's house. He kept none of the riches, though, dividing it all between the poor of the kingdom and the needy in the castle. That evening, the cows gave fine milk, and Rafferty was well paid. He was also now beloved by the people of the kingdom for his generosity as nobody, not even the king himself, had ever been. In the streets, when he brought the cattle back from that day on, he was hailed by the people who called his name and sang his thanks. Now, that feels like a good place to stop for this episode, but it's far from the end of Rafferty's story. So for the conclusion of the tale of the Sea Maiden, please join me next week. Thank you, everyone, for staying till the end of this episode of Never Lost. If you've enjoyed it, then please leave a like or a comment, because we love to hear your feedback. And subscribe or follow us on Facebook to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you again for joining me. And I very much hope to see you next story.